I had lived in my quiet suburban neighborhood for over 10 years, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, waved when you passed by, and kept their lawns neatly trimmed. It was peaceful, or at least it had been, until Karen moved in 2 houses down. She was the type of woman who seemed to thrive on control, always inspecting her neighbors as if our lives were open books for her judgment. At first, I tried to be cordial, waving politely when I saw her walking her poodle in its ridiculously pink sweater or when she checked the mailbox for the 10th time in an hour. But things escalated quickly, and I learned that Karen wasn't just a little controlling, she was a full-blown HOA tyrant with a vendetta against anyone who dared live life on their own terms. It started with small complaints about the paint on my garage door, the way my kids left their bikes in the driveway, and even the color of the flowers I planted in my garden. I laughed it off initially, assuming her obsession with trivial details would fade, but it only got worse. Karen had a sharp tongue, a flair for drama, and a willingness to exploit every HOA rule to make life miserable. I remember the day it all reached a boiling point. I had just returned from a long day at the local farm supply store, driving my old, reliable tractor, which I used for tending my small property and maintaining the land I loved so dearly. I pulled into my driveway, expecting the usual serene view of my home and yard. Instead, I was greeted by the sight of Karen's oversized, black SUV parked dead in the middle of my driveway, blocking my path entirely. Her glare, sharp as broken glass, met mine from behind the tinted windows. She had positioned the vehicle perfectly to make my exit impossible, leaning out to shout something about violating HOA aesthetics, as if my mere existence in front of her SUV was a personal affront. The absurdity of it hit me immediately, a surreal blend of anger and disbelief. It wasn't just inconsiderate, it was deliberate. Her SUV was a barricade, a statement, and a challenge. I tried reasoning at first. I knocked on her door, using my calmest voice, explaining that I needed to get to my farm equipment to finish a critical project before the weather turned. Karen's response was predictable, a cold smirk, a condescending wave, and a passive-aggressive remark about neighbors learning to follow the rules. My patience, which had been stretched thin over countless prior encounters, snapped. I realized then that words wouldn't move her, that polite diplomacy was useless. What I was facing wasn't a neighborly dispute, it was a full-blown battle of wills, and Karen had chosen her weapon, her massive SUV. I walked back to my tractor, my mind racing with a mixture of irritation, disbelief, and a growing sense of resolve. This wasn't just about a driveway anymore, it was about principle, autonomy, and standing up to someone who had spent years trying to assert dominance over everyone else in the neighborhood. As I climbed onto the tractor, I felt the familiar vibration of the engine beneath me, a sense of empowerment coursing through my veins. I knew the vehicle's power, its strength, and how effectively it could be used to move obstacles, even stubborn, immovable ones like Karen's SUV. The reality of what I was about to do wasn't lost on me. It was extreme, audacious, and borderline insane, but so was her behavior. I wasn't just reclaiming my driveway, I was sending a message. The moment was tense, cinematic almost, as I slowly maneuvered the tractor toward her SUV. My neighbors, who had begun to peek out from behind their curtains and porches, watched in stunned silence. Karen's face was a mixture of horror and outrage, her voice screaming through the windows, but I had already made up my mind. Inch by inch, I nudged the tractor closer, the front loader ready, my movements precise and deliberate. The thrill of standing up to an oppressive force, of reclaiming what was rightfully mine, surged through me. With a final, controlled push, the SUV lurched and began to tilt, its massive frame surrendering to gravity. Time seemed to stretch as I guided it carefully, ensuring it didn't cause unnecessary damage yet proving that I wouldn't be intimidated. In moments, Karen's gleaming black fortress had tumbled into the shallow ditch beside my property, the muffled thud echoing like a victory bell. Standing on the tractor, surveying the scene, I felt a mix of exhilaration and relief. Karen, pale and flustered, stumbled toward her vehicle, yelling, pointing, and threatening, but her threats were hollow, her authority diminished. I had turned the tables. The quiet, respectful man my neighbors knew had vanished, replaced by someone who refused to be bullied, who would fight for his space, his peace, and his principles. That day, my driveway became more than a path to my home, it became a symbol, a statement of defiance against anyone who thought they could control others through intimidation. And as I parked the tractor back in its shed, a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. Karen had learned, the hard way, that some battles you don't win with words. The morning after the SUV had landed in the ditch, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers, speculation, and a few stifled laughs. Word traveled fast when someone like Karen faced public humiliation, and suddenly, my once quiet street felt alive with curiosity. I walked outside with a steaming cup of coffee, surveying the scene with a calm sense of satisfaction. Karen had spent the night fuming, no doubt calling the HOA, law enforcement, and anyone else she could think of to report my outrageous actions. Meanwhile, I had spent the evening meticulously planning the aftermath, because this wasn't just about dumping a vehicle, it was about protecting myself from the inevitable fallout. I knew she would try to spin the story, twisting it to make me look like the aggressor, the bad neighbor, the villain in the quaint suburban tale. But I had prepared. I had documentation, witnesses, and, most importantly, the undeniable fact that she had blocked my driveway deliberately, making my actions a direct response rather than reckless aggression. By mid-morning, the local police arrived, not in the usual sirens and chaos fashion, but in a manner that suggested they already understood the absurdity of the situation. Karen was in full meltdown mode, pacing, waving her hands, and insisting over and over that I had ruined her life, all while pointing dramatically at the SUV that had come to rest in the shallow ditch. I explained the events clearly, calmly, and without an ounce of apology, outlining how she had parked in my driveway, refused to move, and created a hazard, not just for me but for anyone trying to navigate the street. The officers listened, exchanged glances, and asked for statements from neighbors who had witnessed the incident. Unsurprisingly, everyone I spoke to had seen Karen's intentional obstruction and had been shocked by her behavior. Their accounts painted a vivid picture, Karen as the instigator, me as a man pushed to the edge by relentless harassment. Even the HOA representative, who arrived shortly after the police, struggled to maintain a neutral face. It was impossible to ignore that the truth was on my side. Despite the police leaving without issuing any citations, Karen refused to back down. Her anger had shifted from me to the SUV, which now sat half-embedded in the ditch like a monument to her humiliation. She spent hours attempting to push it back onto the driveway, enlisting neighbors who were just as unwilling to help her as they were amused by the spectacle. I stayed out of her way, sipping iced tea on my porch, watching as her frustration grew and grew. I could hear the muttered comments, the strained exertion, the frustrated exclamations as she realized that her once trusty SUV was no longer an instrument of intimidation, it had become a symbol of her loss of control. For the first time, I could see cracks in the armor of the self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer. Karen, who had spent years scrutinizing others, now faced a situation beyond her ability to dominate, and it was oddly satisfying to witness. The incident had consequences beyond immediate embarrassment. The HOA, previously under her influence, began receiving calls from other residents, curious, concerned, and in some cases supportive of my actions. People started to share stories of minor but persistent harassment by Karen, complaints about lawns, decorations, fences, and even window treatments. My bold move had inspired others to speak up, and suddenly, the neighborhood dynamic began shifting. For years, Karen had wielded the HOA like a weapon, a tool to enforce her narrow vision of perfection, but now, with her SUV in a ditch and her credibility fractured, her influence weakened. It was a turning point. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and responsibility. I hadn't just defended my driveway, I had opened the door for neighbors to reclaim their autonomy. It was empowering, though I also knew this was only the beginning. The following week was a roller coaster of phone calls, emails, and in-person confrontations. Karen tried every tactic in her arsenal, threatening legal action, reporting supposed violations, and even spreading rumors about me to other neighbors. But I remained calm, methodical, and well-prepared. Every step she took, I anticipated. I documented everything, kept witnesses close, and leveraged every ounce of credibility I had built over my years in the community. Slowly but surely, the momentum shifted in my favor. My neighbors, once wary of stepping on her toes, began approaching me, sharing their grievances, and quietly thanking me for standing up to her. I realized that this was no longer just a personal battle, it had grown into a community affair. Karen's obsession with control had ignited a spark of rebellion, and while the spark had started with one dramatic move, a tractor nudging a black SUV into a ditch, it was now fueling a larger narrative, that even the most domineering personalities could be challenged when the community stood together. Karen's fury didn't die down with the week, if anything, it intensified. She became unpredictable, striking at every opportunity, as if my act with the tractor had unleashed a personal vendetta she couldn't contain. I noticed her lurking near my property, ostensibly trimming hedges or walking her dog, but her eyes betrayed her intent. Every glance, every whispered comment to a neighbor, seemed designed to unsettle me, to make me second-guess my decisions. But I had learned over the years to read between the lines, to recognize when someone's aggression stemmed from insecurity and obsession rather than reason. And Karen's behavior was pure obsession. The day she attempted to install a "no parking, residents only" sign directly in front of my driveway under the guise of HOA compliance was the moment I realized that she wouldn't relent unless I escalated further. Her audacity shocked even the most patient among my neighbors, who began silently rooting for me to take decisive action. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was protecting my property, my rights, and my sanity. But Karen, blinded by her ego, couldn't see reason. One morning, as I prepared to leave for a day at the farm, I noticed the SUV missing from the ditch. At first, I felt a pang of relief, thinking perhaps Karen had finally conceded, taken a step back, and realized the futility of her actions. But that feeling quickly evaporated when I saw the vehicle reappear, not parked normally, but strategically angled across the narrowest part of my driveway, its engine running, the tires gripping the pavement like claws. It was a clear message, she was testing my patience, daring me to respond. The adrenaline surged as I approached my tractor, which I had left ready, anticipating potential harassment. I climbed into the driver's seat, aware that every neighbor within sight was holding their breath, witnessing a standoff that seemed more suited to a western showdown than a suburban street. My calm demeanor hid the storm brewing inside. I wasn't reckless, but I was determined. Karen had made the decision for me, either I let her tyranny continue, or I acted decisively once again. As I carefully maneuvered the tractor forward, I noticed Karen on her porch, phone in hand, probably calling the HOA or recording the incident to post online. I could hear her shouting, her voice tinged with panic and outrage, trying to incite spectators against me. But I ignored it, focusing instead on precision. Years of working with heavy machinery had taught me control, patience, and strategy. I guided the front loader carefully under the SUV, ensuring stability while maintaining just enough leverage. The moment was tense, surreal, neighbors leaning over fences, kids pressing faces to windows, cameras and phones capturing every second. The satisfaction wasn't in destroying property, it was in reclaiming space, asserting boundaries, and showing that intimidation would not prevail. Slowly, methodically, I lifted the SUV, tilting it just enough to slide it toward the ditch. The physics of weight, balance, and momentum played out perfectly, and with a careful nudge, the vehicle tipped over, landing with a muted crunch in the same shallow ditch where it had begun its first unintended descent. Karen's scream pierced the morning air, a mixture of disbelief and horror, while a few stifled laughs from neighbors revealed that public opinion had already sided against her. Karen, flustered and red-faced, attempted to regain composure, banging on the SUV's windows, yelling threats that sounded more hollow with every passing second. I shut off the tractor, stepping down slowly, taking in the scene with the calm of someone who knew the battle was won, at least for now. My neighbors cautiously approached, murmuring words of support and admiration. Even the kids, who had watched from their treehouses and porches, seemed to grasp the spectacle's significance, a lesson in standing up to unfairness and asserting one's rights. I felt a surge of pride, not from the action itself, but from the principle it represented. Karen had underestimated me, assumed my patience would continue to be exploited, and failed to recognize that persistence, strategy, and courage could outweigh ego and hostility. This wasn't the end of the story. It was a pivotal chapter in a larger narrative of neighborhood dynamics, authority, and respect. The following days were a delicate dance. Karen tried to rally HOA support, bringing in lawyers and experts to argue her case. But each attempt only reinforced the fact that her credibility had eroded. I had kept meticulous records, timestamps of her blocking the driveway, photographic evidence, witness statements, and clear documentation of prior complaints that highlighted a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate concern. The HOA, once her loyal enforcers, began questioning her motives, noticing the imbalance and bias in her claims. Conversations that had previously been tense turned into subtle negotiations, and Karen's once dominant presence felt diminished. Neighbors who had avoided confrontation began approaching me with questions, advice, and anecdotes of their own experiences, slowly transforming the neighborhood into a community less fearful of her influence. I realized, in a quiet moment on my porch, that the tractor and the SUV were symbols, not just of conflict, but of empowerment. By standing up decisively, I hadn't merely defended my driveway, I had sparked a change, reshaping how the entire neighborhood perceived authority, fairness, and courage. As the weeks passed, the tension between Karen and me evolved into something more strategic, almost like a chess game with property lines and ego as the pieces. She seemed to oscillate between feigned calm and explosive frustration, her eyes constantly on me, scanning for any sign of weakness. I, in turn, maintained a composed facade, projecting an image of the unbothered neighbor while meticulously planning my moves. Every encounter became a calculated exchange. Karen would attempt to escalate via HOA complaints, calling inspectors to cite minor violations or questioning my landscaping, and I would counter by documenting the interaction, gathering evidence, and subtly reminding her that every action had consequences. This wasn't mindless revenge, it was strategy. I wasn't interested in humiliation for its own sake. I was defending my life, my home, and the principle that no one could arbitrarily dominate others through rules, intimidation, or fear. Each day reinforced the reality that inaction in the face of persistent harassment only emboldens the aggressor, and Karen, with all her self-assuredness, had overstepped every boundary. The neighborhood, once silent spectators, began playing a role in this unfolding drama. Neighbors whispered behind fences, exchanged nods of approval, and shared stories of Karen's prior attempts to control their lives. The balance of power slowly shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't just me standing up to Karen, it was the entire community subtly reinforcing that her reign of micromanagement and petty enforcement had limits. For the first time, I realized that my actions with the tractor and the SUV had done more than solve an immediate problem, they had become a catalyst for collective empowerment. I was no longer alone in resisting arbitrary authority, my stand had validated others' frustrations, giving them courage to voice their grievances and push back in small but meaningful ways. The dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Karen, of course, refused to accept this quietly. She devised schemes that ranged from intrusive monitoring of my property to attempts to mobilize HOA allies to create sanctions against me. She even went so far as to call in what she believed were professional mediators to lecture me about neighborly conduct and community standards. But with each attempt, her efforts crumbled under scrutiny. I had anticipated most of her moves, kept records of every conversation, and, crucially, ensured that any neighborhood witnesses were aware of her tactics. One afternoon, she tried to block my driveway again, this time with an old pickup truck she had borrowed from a relative. But the reaction was immediate and decisive. Neighbors who had once observed silently stepped outside, their expressions pointedly neutral or mildly amused, silently communicating to Karen that her manipulations were no longer effective. The sense of collective oversight created a new layer of protection. She could no longer act without the implicit awareness of the community. The final confrontation came on a sunny Saturday morning, when Karen, in a desperate and audacious move, attempted to orchestrate a neighborhood inspection to cite me for alleged violations. I had seen it coming and prepared accordingly. I climbed onto my tractor, ensuring that all safety measures were in place, and calmly navigated toward my driveway. Karen's SUV, shiny and defiant, was positioned yet again, but this time, the outcome would be different not just because of brute force, but because of planning, principle, and timing. As I approached, she waved her arms, screaming, threatening to call the police, and ranting about fairness, rules, and morality. But the crowd had grown, neighbors emerged from their homes, cameras and phones in hand, not to record for social media but to serve as witnesses, reinforcing the truth. Karen had repeatedly harassed, blocked, and intimidated me without legitimate cause. With a calm, measured motion, I guided the tractor under the SUV, lifted carefully, and nudged it toward the ditch one final time. There was a collective gasp from the onlookers, followed by murmurs of approval. Karen's face, pale and contorted with disbelief, reflected the absolute culmination of her frustration. She realized, finally, that her attempts to dominate, intimidate, and control had been neutralized. By the afternoon, the dust had settled, the SUV resting harmlessly in the ditch, and Karen retreating to her home, sulking and defeated. I parked the tractor, wiped the sweat from my brow, and stepped back to observe the scene with a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about property destruction or petty revenge, it was about justice, accountability, and reclaiming what was mine. The neighbors, emboldened by my stand, began speaking more openly, discussing HOA regulations with newfound confidence and asserting their own rights. The neighborhood had shifted from passive compliance to active awareness. Karen, once the self-appointed enforcer, had become a cautionary tale about the limits of control, the dangers of obsession, and the inevitable consequences of underestimating a determined, principled neighbor. That day, my driveway was more than a path to my home, it was a symbol of courage, resilience, and the unassailable truth that no one, no matter how loud, aggressive, or entitled, can intimidate an entire community when they choose to stand together. In the days and weeks that followed, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, but nothing was ever quite the same. Karen's influence had waned, her reputation irreparably tarnished, and the aura of control she once wielded evaporated like mist under the morning sun. I could sense the change in subtle gestures. Neighbors greeted me with more warmth, conversations became candid, and small acts of defiance against petty HOA overreach, once unthinkable, were quietly celebrated. I maintained my routines, tending to my property, working with my tractor and farm equipment, and enjoying the freedom of a driveway unblocked by entitlement. Yet the experience left a lasting imprint, not only on Karen, but on everyone who witnessed the unfolding drama. The story of the SUV in the ditch, of a man refusing to be bullied, became a shared reference point, a tale whispered over fences and at backyard barbecues. It was more than entertainment, it was a lesson in standing firm, in using intelligence, preparation, and courage to overcome the unreasonable. Karen, for her part, retreated into a quieter existence. The HOA still existed, of course, but her attempts to manipulate it were increasingly ignored. Any complaint she lodged was met with scrutiny, witnesses, and documentation that revealed a pattern of harassment rather than legitimate concern. I never gloated or sought to escalate unnecessarily, my goal had been to defend myself and assert boundaries. But the psychological impact on her was evident. She had been forced to confront the consequences of obsession, control, and ego-driven behavior. I occasionally caught glimpses of her muttering to herself on her porch or gesturing helplessly at neighbors who refused to be intimidated, and I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and pity. Karen had created her own downfall through relentless aggression, and my role had been simply to meet her with clarity, resolve, and action. It was a humbling reminder that sometimes the most powerful response is measured, principled, and unwavering. The neighborhood itself underwent a subtle transformation. Conversations about property boundaries, HOA rules, and community standards became more transparent and collaborative. I found myself mentoring a few neighbors, sharing strategies for dealing with overbearing personalities, while emphasizing patience, preparation, and legality over impulsive retaliation. The SUV incident became a reference point for these discussions, not as a tale of chaos, but as an example of standing one's ground with intelligence and foresight. Children, once intimidated by Karen's reputation, began playing freely in yards, while adults felt emboldened to voice concerns about minor infractions without fear of retribution. The community, once passive and cautious, had grown more resilient, more self-aware, and more united. My actions had been the catalyst, but the lasting change was collective. That sense of empowerment, subtle but powerful, reminded me that defending oneself responsibly can ripple outward, shaping the lives of others in unexpected ways. Reflecting on the events, I realized how much this experience had changed me personally. The calm, patient man who had once tolerated minor slights had evolved into someone who understood the balance between restraint and decisive action. I had learned to anticipate aggression, to document evidence, and to act with courage when pushed beyond reason. The tractor and the SUV were more than tools or vehicles, they were symbols of boundaries enforced, justice claimed, and principles maintained. I often recounted the story to close friends and family, emphasizing not the thrill of the physical action, but the thoughtfulness, patience, and foresight that made it successful. Standing up to Karen had tested my composure, strategy, and moral judgment, but it had ultimately affirmed that a principled person can confront even the most audacious bully without compromising integrity. By the time autumn arrived, the incident had fully settled into neighborhood lore. Karen, still a resident but with diminished influence, was forced to navigate her community without the leverage she had once assumed was untouchable. I continued my daily routines, occasionally glancing at the spot where her SUV had landed, now a quiet reminder of the lessons learned, patience, courage, and the refusal to be intimidated. Life moved forward, with lawns mowed, gardens tended, and children playing freely along the street. And though the memory of that confrontation remained vivid, it no longer carried the weight of fear or aggression. It had transformed into a testament to resilience, strategy, and the quiet power of standing your ground. My driveway, unblocked and clear, symbolized more than access to my home. It embodied the principle that, in the face of unreasonable opposition, deliberate action, planning, and integrity will always prevail. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear and micromanagement, had become a place where respect, boundaries, and community cohesion finally mattered, and in that transformation, I found not only victory, but lasting peace.